At the beginning of the biblical book of Ruth, we learn how the story of a woman named Naomi takes the most tragic of turns, is rewritten in the most unthinkable ways. Her husband dies, leaving her with 2 sons. They grow up and get married, but within a relatively short period of time, they also die, leaving her responsible for the care of their 2 widows. To be 3 widowed women responsible for their self-care in that day and age left them very vulnerable. Making the best decision she could, Naomi decides to return back to her homeland of Judah, where there's a promise of at least some additional security. Before she goes back, she tells her daughters-in-law that they may feel free to return to their people, their parents, their homelands. Because if they do that, they're going to be pulled back into family and they're going to be provided the care that they need. One of the daughters, a woman named Orpah, a name that means back of the neck, decides that she's going to leave Naomi and return to her people. She is appropriately named as she turns her back on the needs of her mother-in-law. But the other daughter-in-law wants to stay with Naomi and makes a beautiful covenant with her to do so using these words. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. The woman's name who made this covenant was Ruth, which means friend, devoted person. So Ruth and Naomi leave their place where they were living and they head back to Judah. And when they get there, they go to the town of Bethlehem. And as they arrive, it causes this great stirring among the people. Because they see Naomi and they think they recognize her, but they're not sure it's her because she has changed. She is a shell of her former self. And finally, someone goes to her and they ask, "Are you Naomi?" And she says, "Don't call me Naomi any longer, for my name is Mara." And in that moment, she changes from the name Naomi, which means pleasant or pleasantness, to the name Mara, which means bitter. Because the pain that is inside of her is so bitter that she's just broken. Now, Ruth, as they get there and they start to settle down, Ruth talks to Naomi and says, "Look, I'm going to go over to the fields and I'm going to start gleaning some grain so that we can have food." It was the beginning of the barley harvest, you see, and there was a law, a biblical law that required landowners, that required farmers to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that those who were poor and in need and those who were immigrants in the land could come and get the food that they needed. And so Ruth wants to go to the field and begin to glean, as is her right as a widow, so that they have something to eat and be taken care of. Now, there happened to be in that land a man named Boaz. He was related to Naomi on her former husband's side of the family. He was wealthy. He owned some land. And so Naomi tells Ruth to go and glean from his fields. And so she does. And as she is in the field harvesting grain for she and Naomi, Boaz comes along and he sees her. He approaches her and asks, he approaches some of his own workers and asks who she is. And they tell her, that's Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who has just returned because her husband has also died. They're both widowed. So Boaz goes to Ruth, and as he goes to her, he says, "Look, it is okay for you not just to glean on the outsides of the field. You may glean wherever you like. You may work and follow the women, my women workers in the field. You may work and you may follow them and work with them. You may drink water out of the wells that my men have dug. And no one will harm you." He even goes so far as to require that the people who are harvesting the grain give her a portion of that which they harvest. Now, when Boaz shares this news with Ruth, she just falls on her face and she begins to give him thanks. And she says to him, "Why would you be so kind to me? Why would you do this?" And he says, "Because I've heard your story. I know who you are. I know what happened to Naomi, and I know what happened to you. And I know that you chose to stay devoted to her and to care for her." You see, what Ruth had done was to serve Naomi in a way that Boaz was certain would please God. And because it would please God, he wanted her to be rewarded on earth. That night, Ruth returns to Naomi, and she's just got so much food, way more than she could have ever received on her own. And Naomi asks what's going on, and Ruth tells her the story. And Naomi, she comes up with a plan, because, see, Ruth has taken such good care of her that now Naomi wants to make sure that Ruth is going to be taken care of in case something were to happen to Naomi. And so she begins to come up with a plan to make that happen. And the plan was based on a religious law that required the relative, the closest relative of a person who had died, a man who had died, to marry and take care of his widow. It was kind of a connection to the whole Levirate marriage law that you may have heard of. So there was this expectation and requirement, and so Naomi is hoping that they can draw on that tradition, draw on that law, because remember, Boaz is related to Naomi's widow. I mean, to Naomi, who has been widowed, he is related to her deceased husband. So she thinks if Boaz will marry Ruth, then Ruth will be taken care of. So Ruth approaches Boaz with the idea, and he's open to it. But there's a problem. There's actually a relative who is more closely connected to Naomi and therefore to Ruth than Boaz, and he has to have the first right of refusal under this tradition, under this law. And so Boaz makes an offer to him, and the man refuses. And so Boaz and Ruth get married. And they eventually have a son, and they name him Obed, which means one who serves. Obed has a son named Jesse. Jesse has many sons, one of whom is named David, who grows to become the greatest servant king in the history of Israel. And we also know that David's lineage is what leads to Jesus. Jesus' story is linked all the way back to this amazing servanthood story that's found in the book of Ruth. Now, I don't know if you've read the book of Ruth recently, but I encourage you to do so. It's a rather short book. You can read it rather quickly, but while it's a short book, it is long on lessons. And one of the lessons that really stood out to me as I studied it this time is the fact that while this is a story of tremendous faith, God doesn't play that big of a part in the story. And what I mean by that is there is no real direct intervention by God in this story. The people in the story all believe in God. They all have faith. But the heart of this story isn't about how God intervenes in the lives of humans or in the situation that it's working on through some kind of divine power. Instead, it's a story that demonstrates the power of faith when people live into the teachings of God. And at the core of this story are three individuals who are committed to serving others, even when it puts their needs ahead of their own. Naomi is committed to serving Ruth, her daughter-in-law. Ruth is committed to serving Naomi, her mother-in-law. These are rules of faith. They're living into that. They're serving one another. They're caring one another. Boaz lives out his faith by following the law of gleaning, by offering to those who are poor and who are in need the opportunity to come to his fields and to be fed, even though that is impacting his bottom line in a significant way. His faith calls him to serve others. Now, what's powerful about this is this notion of service seeps through this whole thing. There's tragedy, there's struggle, there's hardship, but the way that they approach it is to remember that if they're going to get through those struggles, they're going to get through it better when they get through it together. And so they come together, and in mutual service, they turn tragedy into triumph. And again, this idea of service and faith and sacrificing for one another is such an integral part of these individuals and their lives and their story that they name their son after the idea of serving others. They call him one who serves. And then, of course, this child named one who serves is in direct lineage with Jesus, who has served humankind in a way like no one before or since has served humankind. It's just such a powerful and great story, a great witness about the power of faith and what happens when we come together as community and care for one another and walk alongside one another through whatever comes our way. It goes without saying that over the last several months, the story of our world, of our nation, of our communities, of our families, it's been rewritten in the most tragic of ways. There have been far too many people who have experienced the disruption of economic loss and sickness and death, and many people have known that bitterness that Naomi described from everything that's going on right now. When we were at the beginning of this journey, it was interesting to watch faith leaders and political leaders and community leaders all come together with this powerful message about how difficult this time was, but if we were in this together, we could get through it. We could make it happen by caring for one another and putting the needs of others ahead of the needs of ourselves. We could get through this crisis. And if you look back, you can see so many incredible examples of people doing just that. Setting aside our wants for the needs of others, our nation came together and we worked hard to be safe at home and to limit our risks and our exposures. And those who were frontline workers were out there every day taking risks, doctors and nurses and medical staff and people who were out there taking care of others, making sure that they were okay, risking their own health and lives and those that they know and love for the sake of serving others. We came together as a nation and we offered financial support for those who were struggling. Nonprofits and faith communities doubled their efforts to make sure that anyone who was in need was taken care of. And we've done that as well as a church. This is what we are called to do as a people. We were called to come together, and there's so many examples, and you can go through and just see inspiring example after inspiring example of how people came together. It's interesting, when we first started this and people started talking about how we're better off when we work together, some people got tired of hearing it. They heard it so much that if I hear one more person say that we get through this better when we get through it together, I'm going to lose my mind. But the reality is true. And as a people of faith, that shouldn't have come as a surprise to us. But as of late, there seems to be some shifting. There seems to be a larger number of people, even people who proclaim deep faith in Christianity and devotion to Jesus Christ, who have started pulling back from caring for others, for serving for others, even before they serve themselves. And I'm not talking about needs here, which I think is important. We all have needs, and we meet those needs together when we meet those needs better when we meet them together. I'm not talking about putting my needs before your needs. What we're seeing more of are people putting their desires ahead of other people's needs. And the list of examples of this is long. And I know you know what I'm talking about. I know you've seen examples of this, and it is setting us back. And I wonder, when is it that we're going to turn this thing around? You know when the story of Naomi turns around, when the story in the book of Ruth turns around, it turns around when they start setting their own desires aside, some of their own needs aside, and start putting others first and start working together and start sacrificing to make sure that everyone is okay, because they understood that when one person suffers, we all suffer. So they set some things aside for the sake of the whole. And as they did that, that story shifts and tragedy becomes hope. We saw that happening at the beginning of our story as well, and now it feels in some ways like that's slipping away, and I get it. We're tired, we're fatigued, we're worried, we don't know what's going on, and it's vulnerable to sacrifice ourselves to care for others, because what if people won't do that for us? It's vulnerable and it's frightening. But friends, it's the story of our faith. It's what it means to be Christian, that we are in this together, and when one person suffers, we all suffer. I think one of the things we need to do as a community of faith is pray. We need to pray and pray and pray, but understand this: as we pray for God to intervene and bring healing and hope into this world, we need to remember that God has given us everything we need, and maybe even more, to start addressing this and taking care of this ourselves. And so while we pray for God to intervene and be with us, we are called to live like it is up to us and follow the example of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and all those individuals who came together to serve one another. Friends, I don't want us to be like Orpah, the one who turned the back of her neck on others when they were in a time of need. I want us to be like Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. I want us to live lives that reflect the name of Obed, their son, one who serves. I want us to be a people who live in reflection and in the path of Jesus Christ. And that means that we serve one another, that we care for one another. Now, I believe in the best of humankind. I believe that when we draw together, there is nothing we can't accomplish, and there is no challenge that is too great for us to overcome. And it may sound naive, but I believe in it. I believe in us. We have been through tougher things than this. Having said that, if we don't set aside some of our own needs, and especially our own desires for the sake of others, there's going to be a lot more bitterness. There's going to be a lot more tragedy. And there's going to be a lot more pain. My prayer for all of us is that we'll step into the lineage of our faith, and we will serve the way we have been served. We will love because God first loved us, and we will express our faith by caring for others. Because when one person suffers, we all suffer. May it be so. Amen.